So, I'd like to introduce Rafael Wlodarski, who's from Robin Dunbar's lab in Oxford. Rafael is a postdoc there, and he also did his PhD there too. And before that, I'm reliably informed that he did a decade's worth of travelling and cultural and logistic research for a well-known travel guide. But since then, he turned his mind to more serious matters. And his latest research got global media coverage from such media outlets as the Daily Mail on the one hand, the New York Times, and Al Jazeera. So the subject that interests all these media outlets, and I hope will interest us today, was summed up in one of those headlines as saying, from now on we know that a kiss is not just a kiss.
Thank you very much, Dr. Opie, and thank you for inviting me here to talk to you about this very important subject of romantic kissing, which I think obviously most of you will agree is quite interesting because you're all here to find out a little bit more about it. So what I'm going to talk about is a little bit of research that I conducted, preliminary research into romantic kissing as part of my PhD, because this is a fascinating topic. So I'm going to begin very TED Talk-like with a little bit of a walk through and ask you to bear with me and sort of go on a little imaginary trip. I would like you to imagine that you're at your local pub. I would like you to imagine that you are single. You're having a few drinks at your local pub with your friends, and you spy across the room someone of a gender to which you are attracted, and they're a very attractive individual, and you make eye contact, and that person makes eye contact with you. You have another drink, you don't think about it again, but eventually, after 5-10 minutes, you see that person coming closer to you, and they're still making eye contact. And they come very, very close to you, and they're still making eye contact. They obviously seem interested in you as a person, if you will. They look you in the eye, rather seductively. And before they say anything, they go, and hold out their hand and say, would you like to try some? Hands up anyone who would take up this amazing individual on their offer. Is anyone you feel desperate enough? It's a strange phenomenon to do something like that. Yet this is something that we do on a fairly regular basis. This is a very strange activity that's partaken by individuals all over the world to different extents. On weekends, between romantic partners, between relative strangers. This is a fascinating, interesting activity that we think potentially warrants study. So the topic is romantic kissing. By romantic, I don't mean kissing with the rose in hand. Romantic kissing is to differentiate it from other forms of kissing that are socially acceptable, such as greetings with strangers, such as kissing between mother and child, and so forth. So that's what we mean when we talk about romantic kissing. So the structure of this talk is going to be quite a lot of background. As I understand it, a lot of you are master's students just starting out on an evolutionary anthropology degree. I'm not sure how many of you are familiar with evolutionary approaches to human behavior, particularly in the mating context. So I'm going to give a lot of context in this talk. So bear with me if some of this stuff is familiar to you. And then towards the end, I'm going to talk about some of the research that we conducted to try and figure out whether this interesting activity might potentially serve a useful purpose or function in the human mating context. So some background on kissing. Up to, well, around 90% of known cultures in ethnographic atlases partake in some form of close lip-to-lip kissing contact between romantic partners. What about the other 10%, you might think? So the other 10% also have very similar analogous activities. And these close activities between romantic partners might involve sniffing. They might involve licking of the face, the lips, or other parts of the the head region. Or they may involve rubbing, and this is what a lot of people might associate with sort of Eskimo kiss, the sort of Inuit greeting, which actually involves rubbing the nose onto the cheeks and forehead of the other individual and inhaling deeply. So when I say kissing, I kind of am referring to it in the most broad general sense of close face-to-face contact in all the world's cultures. So this form of activity is also historically quite prevalent. There's been hieroglyphs that have been interpreted as a kissing type interaction between romantic partners. Hindu Vedas talk of kissing, and sort of the most direct translation of kissing that is described in these earliest written records that we have of humanity refer to inhaling the soul or the spirit of the other. The Song of Solomon refers to kissing. There's lots of other examples that refer to this type of activity between romantic partners. So it seems to be not only culturally prevalent, but historically quite prevalent. Now, mouth-to-mouth kissing, there is some debate as to whether this is as prevalent as the sort of the other forms of close face-to-face contact that I've just described. So there's some that argue that this is the man responsible for the activity that I just described, Alexander the Great. The reason being that when he expanded his empire and traveled all the way to India, he observed this kind of close face-to-face activity between romantic partners, and he kind of liked it. He liked it so much he thought he would bring it back to the hearts of the Greek Empire, of the empire that he controlled. But somewhere along the way, potentially lost in interpretation was the sniffing aspect, and it became mouth-to-mouth contact. So kissing was prevalent in this time as a mouth-to-mouth form. Now, of course, ancient Rome took over the remnants of this empire, and the Romans really, really liked kissing. They had 3 different names for 3 different types of kisses, one of them being Basium, which was a kiss on the hand or a kiss of respect. There was Osculum, which was a kiss on the lips. And then there was Savum, which is our favorite, which is to do with passionate romantic kissing. So they obviously were quite enamored with this activity. They thought it was a pretty good idea. And it was such a good idea that it obviously spread to much of the Judeo-Christian world that we know today. So this is one account of mouth-to-mouth kissing potentially being a unique form of kissing and potentially an explanation of why it occurs. Whether it's true or not, it's hard to say from the records that we have. Another explanation for potential origins of sort of mouth-to-mouth kissing revolves feeding. So Desmond Morris thought perhaps that pre-mastication of food, which occurs between when a mother takes in a complex food, pre-masticates it and feeds it to a child, then kissing may have evolved from that as a close, intimate activity. And feeding young still occurs in some Judeo-Christian Western cultures. Some mothers will pre-masticate food, but it's also prevalent in certain hunter-gatherer cultures. So when we're talking about a behavior that we think is particularly prevalent in the human condition, we might also want to look at our closest relatives. So do our closest relatives, being chimps and bonobos, for example, partake in this activity? So from what we know, some kissing is observed in these close primates. So among chimpanzees, occasionally there is lip contact and smacking, but the context in which it occurs is typically done more as a reconciliation gesture, as a sign of submissiveness, because it's obviously a very, very dangerous activity to partake with your foe, to offer yourself up, to have lip contact, potentially be bitten, potentially be attacked. So it's a sign of submissiveness, and it's not particularly common. The bonobo, which is sort of known as the sex-crazed hippie ape, our other close relative, they partake in sexual activities with lots of individuals in their group, including mating partners, including friends, including foes, as a reconciliation gesture. There's been observations of them using tongue kissing as well, but again, it's very inconsistent, and it rarely only happens between mating partners. So this sort of activity seems to be almost uniquely human. So if something is so prevalent cross-culturally and so unique, we might want to ask, is there something more to this? If this sort of activity occurs on so many different levels and arises independently in different cultures and potentially is transmitted so easily, does it potentially serve a function? So there is some predictions or some competing hypotheses as to why human beings might partake in romantic kissing. The first one being mate choice. So it might, in some potential way, help you assess or choose a potential mating partner. Another theory is arousal. Obviously, it's an arousing activity, but this theory postulates that the primary and only purpose, really, of kissing is arousal, and everything else is secondary and not as important. And bonding being the last one. So it helps create and maintain close affiliation, bonds, mating pair bonds between two individuals. So I'm just going to go briefly through these 3 theories and sort of outline how they might work and why people might think that these theories might be potentially true. So mate choice, arousal, and bonding. So first of all, mate choice. This is what mammalian dating looks like. It's fairly straightforward. Oftentimes, mammals will choose a mate based solely on potential genetic fitness and even genetic compatibility. So many mammals, and the most closely studied have been rats, will preferentially choose to mate with a partner that is genetically compatible to them. And by genetically compatible, I'm only referring to one particular set of genes called the MHC series of genes, major histocompatibility complex set of genes. These genes code for immunocompetence, so how good you are at warding off infections. And one of these rare sets of genes where offspring will take the best of both parents' worlds and put them together. So if you mate with a partner that has exactly the same immunocompetence as you, then the offspring will have the same immunocompetence. However, if you mate with a partner who has a different immunocompetence, they're better off fighting off some infections but not others, and you are good at fighting some infections but not others, the offspring will have the best of both worlds. So this is an ideal situation if you want to pass on genes, to create offspring that are going to be very versatile at fighting off infection. And so in many mammals, and again, as I mentioned, most closely studied being rats, MHC can be determined from pheromones, which are highly prevalent in urine in rats as well as in humans. And so animals will preferentially mate with another mate who is genetically compatible to them. So this has led some researchers to ask, well, do humans have pheromones? For a long time it was thought humans do not use pheromones at all. The definition of a pheromone being some kind of chemical that communicates information within a species to another member of that species. So our olfactory bulbs are actually quite diminished. We're a very visual species. And obviously, since the turn of the last century, it was thought that human beings are quite uniquely special. We're so much better than the animals. We're so much different and so much more evolved that surely we wouldn't be using such a basal, primal activity in our daily interactions. We wouldn't be making decisions on this. However, this didn't stop individuals from actually conducting research. Well, we may as well test this hypothesis. So research was done in pheromones in the 70s, and one of the seminal studies that is related to mating are the T-shirt studies. Hands up if anyone has heard of the T-shirt pheromone studies. Okay, so they get around. So basically, what happened is men were asked to wear a very plain T-shirt for 2-3 nights in a row. I think it was 25 to 30 men who were asked to wear these. They were genotyped, first of all, and they were asked to wear those T-shirts. And those T-shirts were then individually presented to female raters, who were asked to smell those T-shirts. And they were asked, how attractive is this person? How sexy are they? How attractive are they to you? And so forth, these sort of questions, to try and figure out whether any information might be conveyed by human smell. And so what was found was that women rated the smells of T-shirts as sexy if they were genetically compatible, and exactly the same sort of thing as happens in mates. So if their MHC compatibility was higher, if there was more differences in MHC coding genes, then those smells were rated as more attractive, which is a fascinating finding. And this opened up a whole new field of research into pheromones. The problem being that there are so many chemicals in pheromones, and we barely have scratched the surface. We have no idea what does what and how it works. But from these studies and others that followed, we do know that there is something in that. And there's also other information that can be conveyed by pheromones. Genetic fitness, so fluctuating asymmetry, which has to do with how even both your sides of your body are, which is related to potentially genetic competence. Other aspects of attractiveness can be also conveyed through smell alone. Health, so general health, halitosis, for example, or other ailments can be conveyed by information using smell alone. Personality, even, there's been a few studies in the last 3 years that when women have a better than chance at guessing the personality of an individual based on smell alone, particularly when it comes to extroversion and neuroticism. So there is definitely some information being conveyed there. And there's a few studies that have looked at ovulation. So ostensibly, in humans, we have concealed ovulation, so you cannot tell when a woman is ovulating in her menstrual cycle. But studies have found that men are actually better than chance at guessing whether a woman is ovulating based on smell alone. So there's information that can be conveyed by smell. And if you think about kissing, it is perfectly placed as a culturally acceptable way to get close enough to another individual to potentially smell their pheromones, which you might not otherwise do if in a culture where that's not socially acceptable, for example. So the next theory has to do with arousal, that kissing sole purpose is arousal. So this is the homunculus, which is a graphical representation of the amount of somasensory cortex in the brain that is dedicated to receiving information from different parts of the body. So what's happened here is they've taken a normal human figure and they've exaggerated the parts where extra sensation is received and processed in the brain. And as you can see, the lips are very, very sensitive. So if arousal is dependent upon receiving external stimulation in part, this is a fantastic way to create stimulation. And you'll notice that it's much, much more sensitive than the genital region, which is what most people would normally associate as a highly sensitive region. So it's a very, very efficient way at creating arousal. And even if we don't have physical contact with the lips, which is how this arousal might work, pheromones have also been found to help arousal or induce arousal in another individual. This is androstenone, which is one of the few chemicals that we actually know for sure is a pheromone in human sweat. And androstenol is a related pheromone. And this pheromone is also present in wild boar saliva. And in this saliva, when male boars release androstenone, then female boars go extremely attracted when they are in heat, and they preferentially copulate with male boars who are using this exact same compound and chemical. And in human studies, it's been found as well that this compound, when placed on individuals or in certain situations, can increase arousal. So you don't necessarily need lip contact to induce arousal in another individual. And arousal is obviously useful in the mating process. It increases the likelihood of a successful mating encounter. So it increases the chance that you'll go from this to this. So arousal, there's been a very interesting study done by economists that high levels of arousal alter your decision-making abilities insofar as you prefer immediate rewards versus long-term rewards. It also increases the likelihood of any encounter leading to a sexual encounter, increases the likelihood of making risky or poor sexual choice decisions as well. So it's very effective at sort of moving a sexual mating encounter in that general direction. And obviously it's important for physical readiness for sex. And the last theory that is being proposed as a function of kissing has to do with bonding. So human beings are a pair bonding species, which is very rare in the mammal world and relatively rare among primates as well. So the reason we pair bond, we create these intimate mating pair bonds that last much longer than a brief sexual interaction, is because of biparental care. And part of that, well, biparental care is an extremely important outcome of pair bonding anyway. So these little creatures, these little children, as soon as they're born, are extremely difficult work. I don't know if anyone has had any of these. You'll know that when they come out, they're essentially quite useless for quite a long time. They require a lot of time and a lot of resources. And a mother raising a child on her own is under a lot of strain and pressure to raise that child to maturity. And so with the help of biparental care, there's a much greater chance that that child will survive to maturity. And there's a very good review article by Geary looking at all the sort of outcomes that are improved or altered in the presence of biparental versus uniparental care. So we know that attachment is important. So there's I sort of skirted over the issue whether attachment and sort of biparental care is the sole reason that we are essentially a monogamous species. So there is some debate on this. Dr. Opie there had a paper last year saying that infanticide risk was the main driver of monogamy and sort of pair bonding in humans. And just a few months later, another paper by Lucas Clinton-Brock said, no, it has to do with dispersal patterns. They're the main driver for human biparental care and monogamy and attachment. And then there was a little bit of debate, no it's not, yes it is, and then this turned into a very interesting debate, which I will not go into. You can ask Dr. Opie, if you will, about the current standing of this. My point is that biparental care does have important outcomes for child rearing. How it originated is up for debate. And of course, arousal and bonding are also closely related. So we talked about arousal before as being one of the theories, one of the sort of potential main drivers of kissing. But arousal also has other effects that relate to bonding. So when the heart is pumping, then there is neurotransmitters and hormones that are released in vast quantities, including serotonin, dopamine, mu-opioids, the oxytocin, the bonding chemical. There's still debate again which one of these are important in bonding, but it's undoubtable that arousal helps to increase these chemicals and improves bonding between individuals or increases attachment. It helps memory formation. When something's highly arousing, you're much more likely to remember it. So if you're kissing a particular individual, you're much more likely to remember them, to think of them, to potentially also create an attachment bond. And of course, it's rewarding. It feels really good. And when something feels really good, we like to do it again. And if it felt really good with that person, we're going to do it again with that person. So these are some of the ways in which kissing might potentially leads to bonding effects. There's also an element of physical risk involved in kissing. So obviously, kissing, you're exposing yourself to influenza, herpes, meningitis, all kinds of potential illnesses. So when I said at the beginning, when I gave you that imagery of someone spitting into their hand, you wouldn't lick it, you wouldn't touch it, because you know that there is quite potential for health risks involved in licking somebody else's saliva. So this is a physical risk activity. And there's a theory in psychology called cognitive dissonance that if you do something that is dangerous and risky that you probably shouldn't be doing, and it doesn't agree with your sort of your reason for doing it, you'll change your reason for doing it. So if you think, I shouldn't be doing this, this is dangerous, do I like this, but I don't even like this person, you're either going to stop doing it or you're going to change your opinion of that person, and you're going to potentially be more attached to them. And it's also a sign of public social commitment. So we're a social species. So when you are kissing or when you're partaking in these kinds of activities in public, you're also sending a sign that you are unavailable. And here we have a very sad individual because that particular individual is unavailable. She's signaling that she is with another partner. Okay, so now I'm going to start talking a little bit about our research. So these two studies that I'm going to be talking about were very early preliminary attempts to sort of figure out which of these three theories might be the best explanation, if any, for the prevalence of romantic kissing. So the methodology was quite straightforward and simple. Rather than delving into observing strangers kiss in nightclubs and forcing people to kiss people that they don't know, we thought we'd do something that was relatively harmless and innocuous. So what we did was we did an online survey and generally just asked people's attitudes to kissing and likes about their kissing behaviors. Now that on its own wouldn't be particularly useful. I mean, people don't remember their kissing behaviors, they will report things favorably. There'll be a lot of, self-report has lots of issues, obviously. So the way we thought we'd get around that a little bit was look at several different variables that we know from past research are related to certain behaviors and see, including, so I'm going to go through some of these in a little bit more detail. So we took individuals' gender into account, their mate value, their short-term or long-term mating preferences, and if they're in a relationship, we'll ask them about their relationship status. And then, looking at just the kissing attitudes and behaviors, we looked at how all of these different variables affected their kissing attitudes and their kissing behaviors. So to be able to understand what we did here, I'm going to have to go through a little bit and give you some background about what we would expect of these different types of individuals, how we would expect them to behave in a mating situation. So I'm going to talk a little bit about gender, about mate value, and about sociosexuality, which is the term for short-term versus long-term mating preference. So gender, according to parental investment theory, Trivers and even before Trivers Bateman, in any particular species, the sex that makes the greater investment in an offspring is the one that is going to be more selective. So the one that has more to lose is going to be a little bit more careful about their mating decisions. Part of that has to do with gamete size. So females only ovulate once a month. They have a huge investment in this one particular egg, whereas males generate millions of sperm on a daily basis. So there is no massive investment in one particular sperm. Obviously, females have to go through an extended gestation period. So the minimal investment that a female has to make in offspring is, at the very least, 9 months. So making a poor decision can lead to quite severe physical and time consequences, whether positive or negative. And of course, extended period of lactation, which is up to 4 years in humans. So this is a massive investment that has to be made by females at the very minimum. I'm not saying this is what they should do, I'm not saying this is what they do, but I'm saying this is the very minimal parental investment that's required of females. Whereas for males, the minimal parental investment is considerably smaller. Males can mate with multiple partners, and the consequences of their actions, the direct physical costs, are much smaller than they are for females. So, what we know from previous research is that female mate choice involves being much more selective. So females are a lot more selective when it comes to selecting mates compared to males. They're interested in parenting potential in a future mate, as well as genetic quality. So these are two different things which are oftentimes flip sides of the same coin. There is research on testosterone, which is ostensibly a marker of genetic quality to some extent, that high testosterone levels and other physical features associated with genetic quality are oftentimes inversely proportional to parenting potential and good parenting. Men who are of higher genetic quality are more likely to stray, more likely to have shorter marriages, have lower physiological responses to infants crying and so forth. So there is a trade-off that needs to be made here at times. And I will talk a little bit about this and how women sometimes might overcome this in the second study on menstrual cycle effects. Whereas male mate choice is a lot more simplified. It's simply physical features and attractiveness, fecundity, are one of the more salient and obvious criteria by which males decide whether they're interested in a mate or not. Because the consequences of poor mate choice, of selecting someone of poor genetic quality, they're not going to be necessarily going to be sticking around for the massive parental investment. And so the best strategy outcome in mammals and humans to some extent involves mating with individuals that have high genetic quality, and if you're not going to be helping bring that individual to maturity, there's a greater chance that they're not going to survive. And so if you mate with multiple partners that have high genetic quality, you have a greater chance of having that offspring survive even without parental care. So that's kind of roughly the differences. But it's important to note at this point that when we talk about men do this and women do this, it's hardly a black and white occurrence. What really happens is we have massive overlap in that most males and most females are extremely similar on a lot of these decisions, and when we look at different mate preferences. But when we look at enough of them, and when we look at tendencies on a very fine-grained scale, we tend to find consistently that there are overall differences between males and females. So mate value is another criteria on which we looked at. So obviously we are not mating in a world where you can go into a room, find the most attractive individual that is most attractive to you, or whatever criteria you're using, and say, now we mate. It doesn't really work like that. They have to want to mate with you. There's competing mates that might want to mate with them. There's lots of things that go into choosing a mate that aren't simply based on your own personal decisions. So obviously physical attractiveness, which is a universal between males and females as an important factor, has a lot to do with mate value. The more physically attractive you are, the more choice you have. If you don't have a whole lot of choice, then there's not much point being selective, because there's very little chance that you might get the opportunity to pass on your genes if you're highly selective and no one is interested in you, for example. So we know that individuals who are physically attractive are more selective. And a way to measure that, which is a very crude, a very rough, but surprisingly useful measure, has to do with self-ratings. So if I asked everyone in this room right now how attractive they thought they were, whether they thought they were more attractive than average, about 80 or 90% of you would probably say you're more attractive than average. That might be because UCL is a particularly attractive university, or attracts individuals of a certain ilk, but people in general have a slightly higher opinion of themselves. So 80% of people will say that they're more attractive than 50%. But within that, there is still a very interesting spread, and there's a very high correlation between ratings of your own attractiveness and how other individuals would rate you. So even though everyone thinks they're more attractive than average, people have a pretty good idea of where they fall in the mating market. So the measure we used in this study was self-ratings of attractiveness. And the last measure that I want to talk about is sociosexuality, which is a complicated term for essentially interest in short-term versus long-term mating context. Again, this isn't a black and white decision. This is a 9-question, 9-point scale, which on one end is one extreme, where you're exclusively interested in sexual relations only in long-term committed relationships. The other extreme being you're only interested in very short-term interactions with lots of multiple partners, and everybody falls in the middle somewhere. So we've got restricted sociosexuality, referring to generally individuals who are more inclined towards mating in long-term relationships. And we've got unrestricted sociosexuality, which involves mating with multiple partners. And these two different individuals have different mate choice criteria. So individuals who have restricted sociosexuality are more interested in resource acquisition potential and more interested in parenting abilities potentially, both males and females, because they're in it for the long term. So they're in it for looking for a partner who would make a suitable partner for a long-term mating interaction, sort of biparental care or a mating pair bond. Whereas individuals who have unrestricted sociosexuality are primarily interested in genetic quality, as is often indexed by attractiveness. So they're much more interested in quality genetic mates and lots of them. Okay, so our dependent variables again, we were looking at how important individuals thought. So in general, we didn't obviously ask people what they thought about kissing in every situation at the time. We just asked them, how important do you think kissing is at, for example, when you first meet someone? How important is kissing when you've been with someone for a long time in an established relationship? And we also asked about how important is kissing during a sexual encounter, before sex, during sex, after sex, and so forth. And then, so the study that I've just been talking about, we're going to call study 1, was general attitudes towards kissing. We've got this methodology again. We've got an online survey, which was around 902 individuals, 2/3 female, predominantly from the UK and the US. So this is a very weird sample, which is sort of Western, educated, industrialized, rich, democratic countries. So it's hardly extrapolatable to the whole world population. But we looked at all these different individual variables, and we know we can make some predictions about what these different individuals might look for in a mate, and then we asked them what they thought about kissing at these different interactions. So this first slide is going to be lots of numbers on it, which I usually don't like to do, but I'm going to give you an overview of what we did, which was looking at how important do you think kissing is at initial versus at established stages of a relationship. So we did it at 2 by 2 by 2 by 2 mixed design ANOVA, looking at these two variables and looking at sex, sociosexuality, and mate value. Then these the variables that are highlighted, which is relationship phase and sociosexuality, sex, sociosexuality, mate value, and then interaction between sex and sociosexuality, came out to be important variables. And they're the ones that I'm going to go through in a little bit more detail quickly now. So first of all, importance of kissing, relationship stage by sex. So this is how important do you think kissing is in general at initial relationship stages versus established relationship stages. So females thought kissing across the board was more important than males. So there's no interaction effect there, it was just in general. So initial relationship stages, where we might think kissing might serve some kind of mate assessment purpose, and also established stages where we think kissing might also serve potentially a bonding purpose. You've already made your mate decision by then, so that would be the reason to be kissing there. The other thing that was interesting that we found was relationship stage by mate value. So individuals who are high in mate value, who rated themselves as attractiveness, also thought kissing was more important at both initial and established relationship stages. Relationship stage by sociosexuality. So this was very interesting. So here we've got restricted individuals. So individuals who are interested in long-term pair bond relationships. There's a significant interaction effect there, where they are more interested in kissing at established relationship stages, where it might potentially serve a sort of a bonding purpose. Whereas the exact opposite was found in unrestricted individuals who are primarily interested in sort of short-term mating encounters. They think kissing is more important at initial than later stages of a relationship. And then looking at sex and sociosexuality. So among males, unrestricted males thought kissing was generally more important than restricted males, and for females it was exactly the same. So this was another significant interaction effect. These are lots of different findings which will hopefully make it a little bit more sense when I put them all together at the end. Okay, so now we asked a different question. How important is sex how important is kissing around a sexual interaction? So how important do you think kissing is immediately before sex, during sex, after sex, and at other times not related to sex? And this is only with short-term romantic partners. So not too surprisingly, before sex, where it might potentially serve an arousal function, and it decreases in importance. And you can imagine there probably isn't really any other times if you're having a one-night stand, so it's not surprising that that is the sort of least important time to be kissing, because most people don't want to be around if you're going to be in a short-term sexual interaction. And then sex with long-term partners, we found something completely different, in that it is also important before sex, but it's also extremely important during sex, after sex, and there's a significant difference here between males and females that at other times, not related to sex, women thought it was as important as before sex, whereas for men there wasn't much of a difference. Okay, so another question we asked, we tried to ask this very similar things in lots of different ways to see if we could tease out what this whole kissing thing is all about. So we asked individuals, has your attraction changed to someone after kissing them for the first time? So this is a very general self-report measure. If you kiss someone, are you likely to have changed your opinion? We don't know exactly how this might work, but if kissing potentially conveys some useful mate information, we would expect that there might be some interesting findings here potentially. And what we did here, the answer to that question, we did a multiple regression looking at sex, mate value, and sociosexuality. Sex, 0 being male, 1 being female. So we found that females are more likely to have had their attraction change after initial kiss. High mate value, attractive participants, and individuals high in social sexuality. So individuals interested in short-term mating interaction. So those people that are interested in sort of genetic quality. Potentially, kissing might convey some information about to do with genetic quality. That's what this question might hint at on its own. It's hard to say though. And then we looked at kissing and relationships. So we looked at how we asked individuals who were in a relationship, which was about half our sample, a whole series of questions about the relationship quality, how satisfied with your partner, could you live without them, those sorts of questions, general relationship satisfaction questions. And then we asked them about their kissing and sexual sort of general behaviors. So we asked them how good at kissing their partner is, how frequently they kiss them, how satisfied they are with kissing, with the amount of kissing, the frequency of sex, and the satisfaction with the amount of sex. We found that everything was a significant predictor except for frequency of sex with a partner. So there is something unique about frequency of kissing that is related to relationship quality, while frequency of sex isn't, which was, I thought was quite an interesting finding. Now, of course, this isn't causation by any stretch of the imagination. It could be when you're more satisfied in a relationship, you do more kissing. It could be if you do more kissing, you are more satisfied with your relationship. I mean, you guys can test that out on your own and tell me how that goes. But it is certainly an interesting finding that frequency of sex isn't as related to relationship satisfaction as frequency of kissing a partner. Okay, so I've just given you a whole bunch of data which probably hardly makes any sense. But what we did at the end didn't make much sense to the reviewers of the paper either. So what we did was we constructed a table that's called the critical tests analysis. And what this involves is, based on what we know about all the things that I described about the different variables that we talked about, based on what we know from past research about gender and sex, about sociosexuality, about interest in long-term and short-term relationships, what kind of predictions would we make for these different hypotheses of mate assessment, arousal, or pair bonding? So for example, if females believe kissing is more important in relationship than males do, this would give support to mate assessment because females are interested in genetic quality, but they're also interested in pair bonding. So the result we found was yes. So these two hypotheses were partly confirmed. If, however, there was no difference, then this would be a unique critical test. So if women and men found kissing equally important, then we could say, well, everyone obviously needs arousal to partake in a sexual interaction. If the answer was no, then this would support solely this particular hypothesis. And we did this all the way through for different predictions, and we looked at whether any of these predictions would support these three hypotheses, and the ones with asterisks would be unique predictions that would support only one hypothesis. And this critical test analysis allows us to look at how many critical tests there would be in brackets here and how many were supported. And so what we find was that 5 out of 6 predictions were supported for mate assessment, only 2 out of 5 for arousal, and 4 out of 5 for pair bonding. So we've got a whole lot of data, and we've looked at it on the whole based on what we know about sexual behavior in the past, and we put it together with our findings about attitudes towards kissing, and we managed to give some support to the mate assessment and the pair bonding hypothesis of kissing. Okay, so now I'm going to talk a little bit about a second study that we did, which was also a preliminary study to try and figure out if we could tease at this question in a slightly different way. And it involves the ovulatory cycle. Does anybody know about menstrual cycle effects on mate's choice? Has anybody heard about any of this in the past? Okay, so I'm going to go over a little bit. As we know, the female menstrual cycle is over an average of a 28-day period. There's considerable fluctuations in hormones, particularly estrogen and progesterone. And a considerable body of research has looked at whether female mate choice changes over this cycle and whether it potentially might be driven by estrogen and progesterone. So this particular period is the most interesting period because during this time of the cycle, sort of the 5 days or so before ovulation, is when a female is at the highest risk of conception. So having sex with a romantic partner at that time has the greatest chance of leading to creation of offspring, of conception. So research has looked at whether females make different decisions during this time versus at other times. And what research has found that during this particular highly fertile phase, there is increased general attraction to males in general. So even though women usually cannot actively tell when they're ovulating, supposedly concealed, their behavior changes. It's not necessarily a conscious decision. Women are not thinking, I am ovulating, I need to have sex with someone now. But it is something that seems to come out and is a subconscious driver, potentially driven by progesterone or estrogen. At that particular time, they're more interested in males who show high testosterone, which is debatably a sign of high genetic quality, but also other aspects of supposed signs of high genetic quality, including fluctuating asymmetry, IQ, and a host of other traits. So at the time of the cycle, when having sex with an individual is most likely to lead to offspring, females will preferentially prefer to mate with males of high genetic quality. Whereas for the rest of the time, females will preferentially mate with individuals who are not as high genetic quality but have more traits related to long-term investment and pair bonding. So when I was saying before that there is this trade-off of sometimes having to choose a mate that either is high in one and high of the other, this has been argued as one potential way of maximizing outcomes. So if women are likely to have an extra pair copulation, which means having sex outside of their relationships, it's much more likely to occur at high ovulation periods, particularly, in one study, for example, when their current partner is not genetically compatible with them. So there's lots of research pointing to the fact that there is some interesting changes across the menstrual cycle. So we thought we could use this information to see how the menstrual cycle might affect women's attitudes towards kissing. Because if kissing serves some kind of mate assessment function, women pay more attention to cues of high genetic quality at that time of the cycle. Would there be differences in sort of attitudes to kissing at that particular time of the cycle? So our research was a much smaller sample. It started off as a very light sample, but we had a lot of exclusion criteria. So we were interested in women who are not using hormonal contraception, because hormonal contraception completely alters the landscape with progesterone and estrogen. So completely alters the menstrual cycle, and it's not particularly useful to say at ovulation there is any physiological changes that are measurable. We were interested in women who had a regular cycle, which means that their cycle occurred on a fairly regular basis within 4 days, and had normal cycle length, normal being sort of used as a sort of one standard deviation of 22 to 36 days. Now, because this was we didn't sort of have the infrastructure to go out and measure women's fertility on any particular day, we had to use a very rough estimate of what we thought, what particular day of the cycle a female was on when she was answering this questionnaire. So we did this by asking them, first of all, their average cycle length. We asked them about the date of their last menses, and then we predicted the day of ovulation based on that information. So if their cycle was 28 days and they had menses 1 day ago, we would predict that 27 days from now they would have their next menses. And 15 days from that is the average that the day of ovulation occurs before the onset of next menses. So using that information, we were able to kind of get a very rough estimate of where in their cycle females were at the time of taking the survey. It's not perfect, so there's much better ways of obviously measuring where women are, but this was sort of a first pass attempt. So what we looked at, well, what we asked is the same sort of question. How important do you think kissing is at initial stages of a relationship versus at established stages of a relationship? This is estimated cycle day, and this is the importance of kissing. And what we found was a very interesting sort of reverse of attitude. So established phases of a relationship, so when you're with a long-term romantic partner, kissing is more important when you're not ovulating. However, for initial phases of a relationship, when you're first meeting someone where kissing might potentially serve a mate assessment function, there's a lump here around the time of ovulation where kissing might convey that information. So this is just a visual representation of the data. We didn't do any analysis on this exactly. What we wanted to know, and what most sort of reviewers would like to know, is what they're interested in is the particular days of the cycle that are most likely to be affected by these hormonal levels. So 5 days before, which is the greatest surge in estrogen, and then the 10 days before the next onset of menses. So these two particular periods are the ones that have the highest surges in these hormones that are potentially responsible for creating changes in attitudes towards mating. So we took only women that fell into these two different phases, which involved women who fell into these brackets, so our N got a little bit smaller. And then we took women who fell into these two different phases, which involved women who fell into these brackets, so our N got a little bit smaller. And then we took women who fell into these brackets, so our N got a little bit smaller. And we looked at initial versus relationship phases and importance of kissing. So at initial stages of a relationship, females who are at low conception risk, there was no difference between kissing importance at initial stages versus kissing importance at established stages. However, when women were at high conception risk, there's a greatly increased difference in attitudes towards kissing around initial relationship stages. So when women are ovulate, at the time of ovulation, when having sex with an individual is most likely to lead to conception, that is when these women thought kissing was particularly important at initial stages of a relationship. So we found this as kind of potential further support as for the idea that kissing might convey some useful mate information. We still don't really know how that might work, but we attempted to try and figure out if we could tease that apart. So we also asked individuals, what do you think what makes a good kiss? We asked people whether it's pleasant breath, scent of body, taste of lips, wetness of kiss, physical contact, physical arousal, same kissing style, lots of different variables that might be involved with a good kiss. Now obviously we're jumping to the conclusion that when you have a kissing encounter and you rate it as good, that is based on some kind of information. I mean, it might have to do with the fact that you just really like the person, they went to the same school and so forth. But a lot of mate choice information is not based on conscious appraisal of a lot of these genetic factors. You don't find someone attractive because they have perfect fluctuating asymmetry or check out that guy's sexual dimorphism. It doesn't work like that. You look at someone and you say hot or not. And that information and that conscious decision is oftentimes based on some kind of unconscious assessment that is taking place during the mating process. So we're assuming, obviously this is quite a leap to make, but we're assuming that when you interpret a kissing interaction as a good kissing interaction, that would most likely be a conscious appraisal of some kind of subconscious decision-making process. Whether it is or not is again, still up for debate. So what we found was that pleasant of breath, scent of body, and taste of lips, there was a significant difference. Well, initially there was a significant difference, but unfortunately after multiple correction for multiple comparisons, the difference did not stay significant at the 0.25 level. But all we can say about this is that there is an interesting trend that has to do with smells and kissing. So pleasantness of breath, scent of body, taste of lips. Women who are at the highest conception risk felt that these things were possibly more important aspects of a good kiss than women who are not ovulating. Whether it's true or not, again, there's a lot more research that could be definitely done on this. So next, we thought, okay, so if hormone levels are the drivers of these attitudes, is there any way we can potentially assess hormone levels? Now, we didn't take hormonal assays, so again, we have a very imperfect measure, and what we did is we based our assessment based on when we thought women were in the cycle. There is a printed table of average hormonal levels for each day of the menstrual cycle, taken from 400 women over a 2-month period. And based on those, so for a woman, for example, was on day 0, a day of ovulation, based on a sample of 400 women, on average, those women had X amount of progesterone in their bloodstream and Y amount of estrogen. So we used those tables and we applied it to our sample, and we looked at whether these very rough and ready measure of progesterone and estrogen in our sample might predict individuals' responses to kissing, whether it's important at initial or established relationship stages. And what we found that in importance of kissing at initial stages, there was a significant negative relationship between estimated progesterone levels. This is multiple regression analysis. Whereas kissing at established stages, there was none. So it may be that progesterone is one of the hormones that is driving this kissing attitude behavior. Okay. So that was a lot of information and a lot of traveling around this. So can we draw any conclusions from this? If we could draw any conclusions based on sort of the initial research that we did, was that we can probably say that mate choice might be one of the reasons that individuals partake in these strange kissing behaviors. Bonding is another very good candidate, whereas arousal is not likely to be the primary driver. People don't just do it for the arousal. So why do we kiss? To choose a partner and to keep them. So that's the Daily Mail takeaway. I think that was one of their headlines, if you had to summarize it. Obviously, if it wasn't in the Daily Mail, we'd like to put an if, but, kavit based on blah, blah, blah. There was lots of assumptions made in the process, but at the moment this is the best we can do. But really, we don't really know that for sure yet. So obviously there's a lot more research that could go into this. We have no idea about the mechanism of how kissing works. Does a good kiss is it actually related to some kind of physiological assessment? Is it related to genetic compatibility? Is a good kiss based on how attractive someone is? Is it based on something completely arbitrary? We have no idea how these mechanisms work, so this is something that's potentially worth looking into. Bonding and neurohormones. So if we're saying that kissing involves bonding, we should be figuring out how that works. I mean, even in the bonding literature, and Professor Robin Dunbar, who's been studying sort of bonding and sociality for 30 years, still isn't convinced which exact hormone is responsible for bonding. But if you're saying that kissing increases chances of creating a long-term attachment pair bond with an individual, you should try and figure out how that might work. Measure neurohormones, measure other hormones. And obviously, this is a very non-representative Western sample, very certain monocultural sample. If you really wanted to make any general conclusions about the sort of the usefulness of kissing across the world, you have to conduct a lot more cross-cultural research. And that is my talk. Thank you very much for listening.